The sun beat hot in the sky above Boksburg on the 10th of April, 1993, but for every South African the day would be drenched in horror and shock. The morning would find the world waking to realize that Chris Hani, venerable leader of the South African Communist Party, and voice echoing across broad fault lines, was dead. It was not a political assassination, it was a bid to assassinate a nation on the verge of transformation. But beneath the headlines was an inextricable network of motive, conspiracy, and half-truth. What drove this tragedy? And why 30 years later do we still seek more light and justice? To appreciate the terror of the bloodshed that morning, we need to turn the clock back. Chris Hani was more than a leader. Born Martin Thembisile Hani in 1942 in Cofimber, Eastern Cape, he evolved from a student activist to be in charge of military wings and political movements. His life traced the paths of millions. He joined the ANC and the SACP in the 1960s, engaged in combat in Umkhonto with Siza, MK. The armed wing of the ANC was arrested, banned, repatriated, and confronted the apartheid machine with militant fervor as well as moral indignation openly. In the early 1990s, when South Africa was negotiating towards the abolition of apartheid, Hani's voice was at the forefront. He struggled for economic justice, land reform, and real change, not just in the state but in power relationships. It was on that cold Easter weekend that South Africa hung in the balance. President F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela were negotiating the shape of a post-apartheid state. There was a tense peace along fault lines of poverty, racial divisions, and armed groups. Hani lived the desire for revolution and was not quieted by token concessions. He danced between statesmen and revolutionary, often infuriating white supremacists and ANC risk-averse moderates. This situated him in peril, savior to repressed multitudes, threat to those who sought apartheid's remaining authority. And the murder. It was 6:20 p.m. when Hani and his wife Lemfo were exiting their home. Two shots struck him down. They were dispatched by Polish right-wing extremist Janusz Wallace. He did not act alone. Keeping and caring for him was his underground apartheid hardline contact in the Conservative Party, Clive Derby Lewis. They were driven by narcissism and terror. They thought that the murder of Hani would stop the transition, reinstate violence, and secure white privilege. The assassins were not solitary shooters, they were part of a broader destabilization policy, nicely coordinated and appallingly accurate. Their track record was immediate and explosive. South African cities were incinerated: Johannesburg, Pietermaritzburg, Soweto. People were consumed by terror, fear, and desperation. A battered nation hung in the balance between civil war. Mandela's reaction amidst anarchy was uncompromising. He called for restraint, urging the people must not allow the murder of Chris Hani to deflect them from the path of freedom and justice. His firm, decisive hand steadied the course. The talks went on and the transition took place, but at fantastic cost, with wounds deeper than ever before. And so many questions remain. Were the assassins of Hani lone radicals or members of a wider network? Why were erstwhile apartheid security men still so disproportionately missing from vigorous interrogation? And what of the twilight realm of state-sponsored destabilization strategies never adequately faced by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And finally, did the assassination intended to break a nation help to consolidate still stronger cohesion? Or did it plant seeds of incompleted justice, grievance, and betrayal? These are the questions we seek. We will map the plotters' trail, the spy officials who may have plotted or inflamed them, how the TRC handled or failed to handle those silences, and why a quarter-century later South Africa continues to seek truth. We will map the court aftermath, Wallace and Derby Lewis's trials, parole outcry over early release, and what they say about race, reconciliation, and remembering. And so we wonder, is there actually an untold story? Or does word of archives, buried testimony, internal documents, and personal diaries suggest that all we can ever aspire to understand is the tip of the iceberg regarding history? As we peel away layer by layer, we'll discover not just the man Chris Hani, but South Africa's soul on the edge. Get ready for a political thriller of suspense, moral balance, human courage, and the burning question of whether reconciliation is ever authentic if history is left incomplete. To determine if Chris Hani's assassination was a masterly matchstick, we need to examine the trigger hands behind it. Janusz Wallace was not born in South Africa. He was a Polish exile of the communist era, ironic considering that he was supposedly combating communism in South Africa. Wallace came to South Africa in the 1980s and was part of that section of white South African society who perceived the post-apartheid era as not a compromise but a survival-critical challenge to their identity. Wallace was in the sphere of influence of Clive Derby Lewis, then the head of the old guard of the Conservative Party, an ultra-right-wing party sustained by paranoia, white nationalism, and religious fundamentalism. Their union was no accident. It was ideologically aligned and militarily focused. Derby Lewis provided Wallace with more than ideological advice. Derby Lewis provided Wallace with a murder weapon and a kill list of individuals to kill. Yes, Chris Hani was but one among a number of names on the kill list. On it were included Nelson Mandela himself and Joe Slovo. That the weapon originated with the state and that Derby Lewis had such close connections into South Africa's security apparatus of apartheid are uncomfortable answers to provide. Was it a renegade adventure by radicals operating in their own interests, or was part of the state machinery and clandestine backing of it? The political weather of the early 90s is not one where the latter cannot be so. South Africa was inundated with clandestine operations. The Civil Corporation Bureau, or the CCB, was already performing selective killings. Double agents in the employ of the National Intelligence Service had penetrated the ANC. Even such a veteran soldier as Magnus Malin and Eugene de Kock eventually admitted to giving or knowing of activities intended to destabilize the transition. These were no momentary abstractions. These were programmed activity, otherwise referred to as third force activity. And then when Hani was assassinated, rapid police action had Wallace and subsequently Derby Lewis in detention. But no further than that. No greater conspiracy was seriously pursued amidst media hysteria, evidence from witnesses, and ghastly inconsistencies. Why? That is the silence that still dishes the nation. The official explanation of events conveniently labeled the murder as one racially motivated crime, a one-off, allowing the new democratic government to carry on without unleashing Pandora's box. The TRC within the Nelson Mandela administration made it possible to expose apartheid atrocities. The victims came forward with stories of violence. The perpetrators came forward and justified their actions. But Wallace and Derby Lewis, when they applied for amnesty in the late 90s, were rejected. Why? Because the TRC ruled their act was politically motivated, yes, but not an exposure. They did not drop handlers, did not exhibit collaborators, and did not unravel the skein. Which brings us to an eerie point: if they didn't disclose more, was it because there was nothing else, or because there was too much? Did they fear retribution from higher-ups who were never charged? Were they protecting something larger than themselves? And most chillingly, was Hani's assassination not just about ideology, but about eliminating a figure whose vision of economic transformation was too radical even for some within his own movement? The less we strip away, the more transparent the contradiction becomes. Chris Hani was an international hero, a political hero too. Charismatic, he was loved by townships of youth, respected by politicians and soldiers. And then towards his final months, he was left on the back burner. The ANC leadership at the top, busy with the negotiations and the bargaining, saw his firebrand rhetoric as an embarrassment. This is how visions of hope and expectation end in tragedy. While Mandela's people were making amends and extending a hand, Hani insisted on justice with change at every level. That conflict between diplomacy and revolution was being built in silence. It is the question which remains haunting: was the murder of Hani convenient to everyone but right-wing extremists? When Chris Hani was assassinated, South African politics turned a new leaf, with politicians moving with gruesome rapidity. South Africa hung in the balance. There were millions of black South Africans who, tired of decades of violence and oppression, were now angry at the murder of a leader who had represented hope, not the negotiated hope of compromise, but the unvarnished hope of revolutionary transformation. Civil war was not in danger, it was inevitable. The tinder had been ignited. The match was lit. And what stopped it from consuming the nation was ironically the very man some considered Hani's opposite, Nelson Mandela. Mandela's decision to speak to the nation that evening was not pre-planned. It wasn't coordinated through the ANC's top leadership. In fact, many within the government were hesitant to act too quickly, fearing escalation. But Mandela knew hesitation would be fatal. He gave a TV speech still learned in political science class worldwide. His soothing voice cut through the rage. He spoke of, "Tonight I am speaking to every South African, black and white, from the depths of my being." He did not speak of Hani as a communist martyr, but as a national hero, a peacemaker who had died too soon. Mandela's action might have saved thousands of lives, but it also raised tough questions. How long would the negotiations last? And could there be elections on the back of this climate of uncertainty? And above all, still, was the movement making a trade-off between justice and peace? For as people were exhorted by Mandela to keep their heads, something else was being played out in the background. Endgame talks were being negotiated at breakneck speeds. In a few weeks, April 27, 1994 was settled as the date for the first democratic elections. This desperate rush was something that all of them had experienced as a victory and as a loss. Yes, democracy was coming. But Chris Hani, who had called for radical structural change, land reform, economic restructuring, bring the apartheid perpetrators to book, was killed. And the compromise that ensued, tectonic as it was, did not bring many of those promises. The new constitution enshrined equality, but the old economy remained. This was enough to cause some to feel that the murder of Hani did more than kill a strong leader, it changed the direction of the revolution. The murder also caused the ANB to move towards the middle ground. The truth is, Hani was not a threat only to white radicals. Hani was a thorn in the side of power brokers making deals with the aforementioned radicals. His candor, his resistance to mythologize the apartheid atrocities, and his insistence on justice made him responsible. And responsibility is a risk in political transition. Meanwhile, Yonish Wallace and Clive Derby Lewis were put on trial and both were sentenced to life. Controversy never left their case. Who had funded their venture? Why was there no investigation into Derby Lewis's links with the Conservative Party or his co-members of the South African Defence Force? Some of the evidence led one to apartheid generals, others to intelligence business. But the bigger questions were never followed up. Years later, when they appeared before the parole hearings, Wallace and Derby Lewis would continue to maintain that they had done it in patriotic motivations to save the country from communism. Their stories were practice consistent and oddly devoid of detail, as if they had played out a role flattering ego into their silence. A silence which continues to dig deep the whole truth. As the years passed, the name of Chris Hani was cry in battle and worst memory reminder of things left undone. His name still hung on posters, on street signs, and passionate political speech, but the justice that he fought for more and more remained beyond their reach. South Africa did change indeed, but was compromised as well. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as groundbreaking as it was in so many respects, was flawed. The victims were given the right to testify over their heads. The perpetrators were given amnesty over their heads. Where are the gray areas then? Where are those who orchestrated, funded, or slumped behind public cubicle work so that violence could follow? The refusal of the TRC to provide any amnesty to Clive Derby Lewis and Yonish Wallace was hailed as an act of integrity. It also shut a larger truth in the face. Since they were not given amnesty, they had no obligation to tell the entire truth. And they didn't. The nation was therefore left with a debilitating contradiction. The two men behind one of the most politically destabilizing acts of South African assassinations were penalized, yes, but never questioned. The nation was left with a theory but no answer. Speculation in the meantime accumulated. Others opined that there must have been some awareness of the plot in the machinery of the apartheid military intelligence. Some thought that growing popularity of Chris Hani among the working class and youth had begun to unsettle even some of the members within ANC's leadership. There were evil thoughts, ones which no one wanted to voice. But they persisted. Whispers in political circles, investigative journalists pushing boundaries, academic papers pointing to the gaps in official narratives all raised the same uncomfortable possibility that Hani's assassination wasn't just about ideology. It was about power. And here's the part that rarely gets discussed: how post-apartheid economic policy dramatically shifted after Hani's death. The ANC, once committed to nationalizing key industries and redistributing land, began to embrace neoliberal reforms. They introduced the Growth, Employment and Redistribution (GER) policy in 1996, a policy far more in accord with capitalist international norms than the radical economic transformation that Hani had advocated. Was this coincidence? Or did the departure of Hani open up space for a more moderate, investment-driven type of transformation? In a sense, Chris Hani was remade into an ideological symbol, sung in eulogies, immortalized on plaques, but bereft of the revolutionary ideal for which he actually paid with his life. The comrade who aimed to dismantle inequality now labored for an establishment that maintained many of those inequalities. And here's the tragedy of tragedies. Not so much the extinguishing of life, but the subtle erasure of the ideals for which the life was lived. And finally, the parole wars. Clive Derby Lewis was released on medical parole in 2015 after 20 years plus behind bars. He died the next year. In 2022, the South African Constitutional Court ruled that Yonish Wallace also had to be released on parole. The ruling evoked protests across the country. This was not justice to some people, it was betrayal. How could a man who had never once spoken truly sorry, who had never once shown the full truth, get to remain free while his victims' relatives were still left in despair and sorrow without closure? Lympho Hani, widow of Chris Hani, was at the vortex of this storm. In a display of unmatched moral bravery, she appealed against the parole ruling. She wished to inquire what many feared to whisper aloud, whether South Africa's justice system was truly for the victims of apartheid or slowly but surely becoming inured to their suffering. By the time Yonish Wallace was finally released from prison late in 2022 under armed guard and shrouded by a device he had once attempted to use to blow himself up, an eerie silence had fallen over the country. Not a quiet of astonishment, it was a silence of weariness. After 3 decades of transition, protest, testimony commissions, and legal battles, the release of Chris Hani's assassin didn't just feel like an injustice, it felt like the final confirmation that parts of South Africa's soul had been traded away in the name of peace. But was it peace or simply survival? This is the uncomfortable truth South Africa still wrestles with. The post-apartheid deal, its constitution, its miracle of democracy, its globally acclaimed reconciliation was miracle stuff. But a deal. And compromises in all deals. The catch is that some compromises take a little longer. Wallace liberation reopened an old scab that would never close. It kept reminding folks that political liberty was there, but economic liberty was not. That apartheid was finished, but equality was not. And when that democracy came, justice was not equal, especially to those survivors of the last regime. The story of Chris Hani is not the story of an assassinated man. It is the story of a dream cut short. Hani did not desire symbolic freedom, he desired material transformation. He desired land reform, empowering the workers and dismantling the structures that had economically enslaved the majority. He desired reconciliation, but not at the price of forgetting. And for it he was killed. What is more touching in his story is that most of the questions he asked are still left unanswered today. South Africa remains one of the world's most unequal countries. Millions remain poor. Land ownership is still imbalanced. Corruption has consumed the institutions that were established to purify the past. And most alarming of all, perhaps, the uncompromising moral courage that Hani represented, the determination to tell hard truth straight, has been lost from mainstream politics. His passing did more than it murdered a man. It stole from us a silence, a vacuum, an emptiness which no one has effectively filled to this day. Politicians speak of reconciliation, but not of addressing structural injustice. Commissions document history, but not of addressing the masters. Elections pass and come again, and the full change Hani dreamed remains elusive to us. And so the unsung narrative of the assassination of Chris Hani is less about who did the triggering or who provided the gun. It's about how the system facilitated it, about the power relations which organized it, about the decisions that followed, and the heritage which remains contentious. And now that new generations grow up in the shadow of democracy, few remember the extent of what was lost when Chris Hani was murdered. His face is plastered on murals, his words reduced to orations. But his revolutionary heart's vision, this demand that justice must be experienced and not simply declared, is lost with the years apparently. The best tribute to Chris Hani is not to weep over his murder, but to confront the truth he was attempting to alter. As long as no effort is made to confront it, the story is still not told, not because there are insufficient facts, but because there is insufficient courage to encounter them.